Transferring wealth successfully starts with asking yourself questions that will give your family a better life now and for generations to come. In this podcast, financial professionals John and Michael from Copper Beech Financial Group guide you through eye-opening questions to help you discover the truth about your wealth. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to The Truth About Wealth with John and Michael Parise of Copper Beech Financial Group. For longtime listeners, you'll know that these gentlemen have done a ton of podcasts, very educational stuff. But right now, I got to tell you, I'm super excited because the gentlemen are going to cover a case study, meaning they're going to just kind of walk through something that they've done, somebody that they've worked with, all the intricacies. To me, it's fascinating. So I hope you are excited as I am. Gentlemen, I love it when you do case studies.
Yeah, that's it's one of our more fun ones to do as well, Eric. And I know that, and we've gotten great feedback from our listeners on that too. I think it does put things in perspective in real terms, because a lot of what we might talk about and do planning for is, we talk about it without a lot of context. So I think having these case studies really puts, some of the quantitative.
It's real.
We do.
It's a real event. It happened.
Yep.
I think anybody that's listening can, and like every piece of the case study is not going to fit them, but I know that they can feel themselves in the shoes of the story that you're telling in certain aspects. That's what I like about it, because it really triggers a lot of questions. I know that you've received a lot of questions after some of these podcasts have been released. Hey, I'm similar to A, B, and C. Could you help me and my family in this situation?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think what we might talk about is we might try to do not one but two case studies perhaps today. But I think one is for probably more of a why it didn't work, and the other one is one that did work. And I think it probably highlights a little bit about the way that we can help families, the way that families view us, and sometimes it's just not a fit, and that's perfectly fine. And we'll hopefully illustrate that through today's podcast. Now, why don't you talk about let's start with the one that maybe didn't work out as well.
Oh, that was a fun case. Yeah, there's a case, we got referred to this particular client by another client. As you already know, we only really work on a referral basis from our families. Occasionally, we get a new client from other sources, but primarily it's from clients. And we got a call from a client, said, listen, you need to really speak to this gentleman. He has some issues that needs to be addressed. I introduced your kind of company to him, and he's very interested in talking to you guys. So we made arrangements to see him. He's right across the bridge here in Philadelphia, and went to see him. Wonderful guy. His nephew attended the meeting, and we had chit chat. And our first step, if you recall, is more of an interview, because to Michael's point a few minutes ago, not everyone can work with us, so we try to help that along the way initially to see if this would fit. Now, after the brief conversation we had with this gentleman, I remember leaving that first meeting and said, I don't think he's going to fit, because he doesn't have some of the components that we look for. But the guy had major issues. I'm talking about major issues. So both Michael and I agreed that we would pursue going through our audit process just to see if we could figure out how he might be able to work with us. And it went very, very well. We put the audit together. Michael's team did a great job, collected all the data. Very, very complex case, very complex situation. And we had an audit report to him and walked him through all his issues. Like most of our audits, discover a lot of problems that families have in their planning, and our job is try to fix those problems. So he was extremely motivated to take a look at it. And Michael spent a lot of time with him, specifically on the estate plan. And Michael, why don't you talk a little bit about your role in that conversation? I was there with you, but Michael had a very deep conversation about his goals and objectives, what he was trying to accomplish from an estate planning standpoint. He owned a very successful company with succession that was a little different for us. So, Michael, why don't you walk through that?
Yeah, it was a family business. As you mentioned, Dad, his nephew was involved in pretty much every meeting, I think, that we had with the business owner. But the nephew did not own any of the business. So the business owner was not married, did not have any children. He was, again, working with his nephew. His nephew was sort of the heir apparent to the business and was actually really in many ways running the day-to-day.
Yeah, he was president.
So if you talk about a lot of what we or if you've listened to a lot of what we talk about on this podcast, business succession is a key component of what we do. And oftentimes trying to find that next generation of leader is a really big project that we work on. Fortunately for this business owner, I think he had somebody that could take
outstanding.
over the company.
Yeah, he was a great leader.
The challenge for the business owner was he had a very successful company. He had significant estate tax exposure. He had really, I don't want to say no liquidity to pay for it, but not much liquidity to pay for it. And so the problem for him was how does he protect the value of that company to get to his nephew? In addition, he had several siblings as well that he was leaving some of his estate to those siblings. Now, what was interesting about this, the estate plan that we reviewed in this audit process, he was leaving his business to his nephew. That was probably 85% of his overall net worth was going to his nephew. And again, his thought was his nephew's involved in the company, and so that would make sense. His siblings were going to receive everything else that he had. That was his plan. The challenge was he had an estate tax exposure that was to be paid out of what we call the residuary estate, which is everything that was going to his siblings. And if you did the math on the estate plan, all of that residuary estate would get eaten up in taxes because that was how his will was written. It's actually a very common provision to include in an estate planning document, but because of the asset makeup of his estate and his net worth, it just didn't fit practically, which again, I think is a good testament to, you might have a good estate document legally that works. It just might not work for you in this particular plan.
And the key element, he was not married. Remember how the estate plan works. You could pass anything or everything to your wife tax-free, regardless of the size of your estate. The tax is due when it passes to the kids. So in this case, he didn't have a spouse, so we're directly to his nephew. So right there was a big bombshell that, okay, how's this tax going to be paid? I'm sorry, Michael.
No, that's good. That's a great point to bring up. So that became really, from a project standpoint, something that we wanted to work on pretty much right out of the gate. And so we brought in an attorney to help facilitate and structure to try to lower the client's estate through various gifting strategies that we've talked about on some prior podcasts. But really, I think at the end of the day, why it didn't necessarily work out is because of the family makeup. I don't want to imply that he wasn't concerned about the estate taxes, but I think that it does tend. I think his view was, I'm going to leave this very successful operation to my nephew, and that's going to be something that everybody else has to figure out if I'm not here. Am I reading into that? I don't know what your thoughts are, but I think it just illustrates sometimes why again, we might not be the best fit for this client, and that was what we thought of when we left that first meeting. You might.
Yeah, we tried to drag him through it, but I don't think. And I kind of understand a little bit, Eric, because when you have the kind of net worth he had, the tax issue was not his problem. It was everybody else's problem. He wanted to live his life. He had a bunch of airplanes. He lived in traveled a lot. Just a very successful gentleman. Nice guy, really, really nice guy. But just if there's no children, if there's no spouse, and there's nephews and nieces and other family members, it wasn't a focus of his. So he didn't really care about the tax. But he left that burden, and to this day, he probably still has that burden to everybody else to try to figure out. But Michael's key point, there was no liquidity to do that. So what basically what will happen if he doesn't have enough liquidity, they're going to have to sell off assets to pay the tax. And that's a fire sale. That's what I refer to as a fire sale. Because how the tax works, if you recall, you have to pay within 9 months of the day of death. And to liquidate a company, to liquidate real estate he had, airplanes, whatever, it would be catastrophic. But he didn't care about that from our sense. And both Michael and I decided that it probably wasn't going to work with him. And he agreed, by the way. The client said, listen, it just doesn't fit. I see what you guys are trying to do. You guys do some great work, but it doesn't fit, my needs. So to Michael's point, it was a case that just didn't flow. The good news is I think he's still working with the attorney that referred in there, at least to get the estate plan that needed to be corrected. But the tax is still looming, I would think. At this, we don't know, but it was a major issue.
Yeah. So let's I think that's pretty much it on that.
Yeah, we dig it deeper,
Yeah.
but it's not necessary. It just did work.
But I think to contrast that with a case that I think did work, and a family that we've been working with for a good number of years that had much more of a multi-generational focus, which is I think where we can really, really add a lot of value. So maybe why don't you introduce this family and
Yeah, the CFO referred us to this family. Now, the CFO knew about Copper Beach. The challenge was we're on the East Coast, they're on the West Coast. It's kind of a funny story. I'll share with you in a second. So the CFO convinced the three siblings, the three family members that were working the company. Dad was still alive. Dad gave him the stock a few years before that. Dad was still involved, but the three kids really ran the business. So we fly out. And they're, golf attire, they're casual. It's an agricultural company. So they're very casual people. So we show up in our power suits. It was kind of, we were suits. We wear suits. So we showed up and we made our presentation. And it was interesting. The father walked in and sat down during the meeting. So we didn't think much of it. And so we spent an hour and a half going through our processes, how we work, or whatever. And the father sat there pretty much for about an hour, and the meeting ended, and we walked out. Everybody walked out, and one of the daughters came in and said, "I've never seen anything like it." I said, "Okay, what? I never saw my dad sit more longer in a meeting ever. He's 10 minutes and he's out. He sat an hour, so he must have really liked what you guys had to say." As it turns out, the father was the one that convinced them that we were the right fit for them. That's part of the story. So it was I guess Dad had instincts that we had the right solutions, the right answers, and we proceeded. And we started to work with the family. Very complex situation. Michael, why don't you go into the minority-owned piece of the business? It's owned by women, females.
Sure. So that was a big component of their company, is that they had some key contracts with key customers and vendors that wanted to work with minority-owned businesses. And so the fact that this business was a minority-owned, women-owned, majority-owned business and had certifications to do that, that was a key component from an estate plan design, that they could not jeopardize that type of that certification, because it would have jeopardized their business and these customers that they had. So we were going through a similar design from an estate planning standpoint, was to be able to transfer and freeze at the value of the siblings' estates by transferring value in their company to a trust vehicle. The trust design had to be, again, designed in such a way to not violate this certification. So it was a very complicated design to put in place, and we had to work with the attorneys to make sure that by making this transfer, that wasn't going to violate that certification. That was a lot of work to get that done, which we were able to accomplish. So that was wonderful to see happen. Now, what had happened probably, I think, 3 or so years maybe after we started working with the family, the father became sick. Father was, I think, in his mid to late 70s, I believe, at the time, and ended up becoming ill. And we had spent a good amount of time in our relationship with the next generation, second generation, and their estate plan. But there was still planning that we always knew had to be done for Dad in this case, and that we weren't able to focus on because we were spending all of our time with generation 2. Well, when we realized that generation 1 was sick and Dad was sick, we had to really shift gears very quickly. So a big thing that we did was, again, generational coordination of these estate plans, was to make sure that based on what Dad's estate plan called for, and this is again, we've probably brought this up a few times, is when you look at estate planning, you're working with a successful business owner, as an example, always really look at what your parents have in place from an estate planning standpoint and how that's structured. If you have an estate tax exposure and you have a successful company and you have a high income, the assets that are being passed down to you from that upline generation might not be something that you need for your lifestyle, right? It could just become more of a tax headache for you and harder for your advisors to work with your planning. So that was the context that we had here. Dad had a successful estate, had an estate tax exposure. He was leaving all of those assets outright to his children. So the Gen 2 business owners that we are working with. Now, if you do the math on that, there's generational, we call it waterfall estate tax exposure. If you look at that type of plan, dad had an estate tax exposure. He was leaving to his kids when he passed away. By the way, he had a second marriage, dad.
I was just going to say,
yeah, that. He was leaving some assets to his second wife, but the majority of that was going to go to his kids. So as you mentioned earlier, Dad, we now had an estate tax exposure at that first death versus in most cases, when you transfer assets to a spouse, there is no estate tax until it goes down the generational line. So we had to worry about that issue. But we had that estate exposure, which was just going to increase the estate exposure of Gen 2. So we had to really jump on that type of planning and bring in the advisors to help with that as well.
Yeah, and the plan on Dad was successful. We diverted all that tax to zero based on the planning we did. But what was interesting about what we uncovered through his data, he had a big pension plan in IRAs that he was leaving his pension plan in IRAs to his 3 kids. Not his spouse. So it unraveled all that, which was a nightmare to do because it would cause all kinds of problems in California if that would occur. So we caught a lot of errors along the way and fixed them, and we probably saved $3 to $5 million in estate taxes on working with that G1 to G2. So it was very successful as far as looking at that waterfall situation that Michael brought up. We have to kind of protect the families on that tax exposure.
Yeah, and when you're working with a blended family like that, there are, of course, different dynamics from a planning standpoint that have to be managed, and that was one of those areas. Again, based on state law, there are certain, let's say, restrictions with disinheriting a spouse, and this is something that comes into play in various contexts. In this case, with that IRA, the fact that that was being left to the children and not his spouse could cause some friction, both legally and then, of course, obviously, because of the legal issues, could result in a family disharmony. So there's a lot of planning that we had to do and conversations that we had to have with particularly the Gen 2 family members to, again, account for that, being proactive, because that's something that, again, when you look at planning, and obviously the loss of a parent and a loved one is a traumatic event in and of itself. And when you add sort of these financial uncertainties or these financial conflicts that can sometimes crop up, that's really where you try to avoid those by being proactive and doing planning ahead of time and looking at that. So again, why we're talking about this case as this case study is one that worked out well is because that was the family really understood the benefits of looking at that, whereas the prior family, again, might not be a concern for that business owner that we talked about earlier, and that's fine. But it really, again, illustrates, I think, the type of family that I think we fit best with. Not that we can't help everybody, but the family that I think we fit best with.
Yeah, one of the things happens along the way here with our families. I'll give you an example. When we bring a new family on and we talk about our fee arrangement, the typical reaction that we get sometimes is, okay, you and Michael put this wonderful plan together. It's going to take a couple of years. Then what are you going to do? What's your arrangement with us? How's that all going to work? So we re-educate them on that our goals are not necessarily just to work with you. It's really manage that financial success through G2 and G3. We look at the generations, and Eric, you already know that. So we have to get the client to understand all that. But I'm telling you that this piece of it, because this family we're working with had that conversation with us. And I think they've been with us 9 years. We haven't stopped working on projects with them for 9 years. And the project is getting larger and larger by the day. And right now we're in the throes of building a deferred comp strategy to retention of key employees because everybody in the world's having problems finding talent for their companies. So retention now has become a conversation with a lot of our families. How do I retain these good people? How do I set up bonus structures? How do I retain them? They're not going to walk out and headhunt by somebody. So we're always working on projects with this family, and they're very successful ones. And I'm going to tell you a short personal story just happened 2 weeks ago. When I went to our conference, this family that we're talking about always comes to our conferences. And one of the parties grabbed me at the bar, have some cocktails at the bar. Go figure, Eric, having cocktails at the bar. Anyway, so we're chit-chatting. He leaned over and he said, I want to thank you and Michael one more time. I said, about what? He said, what you did for their dad was fabulous. because I know how much money you save the family in taxes. And and your professionalism, how you handle it, how you work with us, how you work with them was wonderful. I wanted to thank you again for keeping everything whole. So that was out of the blue. And I had to talk to this gentleman for probably 4 or 5 years. But they remember some of the impact we've had. At least you hope they do, and this family does. So it's kind of wonderful to see the progression of the impact we have for families. But we often talk about a lot of things we put in place. We're not going to be around to see G3. You follow me? So we hope that they see the vision of what we're trying to do. But again, this family's been almost 9 years. Their projects get more intense. We're always saving them tax dollars, always moving wealth generationally. We've been doing it very successfully for this family. So it's a process. It's ongoing. It never stops. Especially if you're a business owner, there's always challenges, right, Eric?
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind is when you're, the old saying, and I think it was Einstein that talked about the eighth wonder of the world is compounding interest, right? What you guys are doing is compounding, right? So you mentioned probably save them $2 to $3 million in taxes, estate taxes at that point, or whatever it was that you really changed in them. That is going to compound for not just the money part.
Oh, you're right.
The way that you help them structure. So in other words, continuing to work with them, continuing to now try to have a deferred comp strategy or some other things in place so that they keep key employees. That's a compounding thing that you're doing year after year, even if you have that 4 or 5 year gap where you don't speak to one part of the party because you've already got things in place. That's just what flooded my mind is like all these different things that you're putting in place. All of that's compounding through the next couple generations, even if, heaven forbid, you're not there to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we often say it's not the tax savings itself. It's what those tax savings could grow to.
Absolutely.
For the future generations or for charity, right? And what's interesting about, we didn't really get into this, but I think that these tax savings that we were able to save from Gen 1 to Gen 2 had an impact with the family creating a family foundation.
Correct.
Because it allowed they said, okay, well, we have this tax savings. What can we do with it? And that's something that the family always wanted to do. And we helped them with that as well. So to your point, Eric, you think generationally, but it does open up more avenues that you can use these funds for, whether it's philanthropy, whether it's the family itself. That's obviously going to be customized to each family and what their goals are for those tax savings. But you're right; it has a big impact long term.
If you go back to the beginning, when we started working with this family, if you look at our impact, as we discussed, we saved a bunch of estate taxes for G1 to G2. And the planning we did for G2, we saved taxes from G2 to G3. So it all is that generational scheme that we talk about, that waterfall tax that Michael mentioned. We protect the family. And to your comment, compounding of wealth, think about the compounding of that tax savings to the families out the generations. It's tremendous. So we monitor all that. We stay on top of it. We work with the family quarterly. They just attended our conference. They come every year. It's just a great relationship. They're a great family. And now they're a family to us, like most of our families. So it's just a wonderful thing to see the impact you have on the planet that we do.
Yeah. And to what's now started to come up is the third generation is starting to leave college. They're starting their careers. There are more conversations around whether they want to get involved in the business or not. And that's going to be, a big project that we work on with that family and how that is going to be structured and whether they come right into working in the business or they work outside the family. There's a lot of dynamics, issues, and planning that needs to be done on that side. And so again, it's that multi-generational component on top of the fact that, okay, now we've put a lot of things in place. We've had a lot of family meetings with regard to, okay, who's going to help manage all of this? And now my children need to be educated, that Gen 3 need to be educated on these structures that we've put in place. And that's really, again, where we talk about the backstage of what Copper Beech does and working generationally with families. All of this comes into play, particularly when you have a business, a successful business like they do.
It's not always about money, Eric, as you and I talked about in the past. It's more to this, at least we believe it is. Money is just a driving force for families to be successful. But how do you control it? How do you manage it? How do you protect it? How do you diversify it? How do you educate? It's just an ongoing project. Again, that's why I created Copper Beech many, many years ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's fantastic. Again, I love the fact that you're just so tightly knit with these families through the generations, because I mean, as a family office, that's what I've always envisioned when you guys have talked about this from the very first podcast, right? I mean, that's all there is to it. So I just love that. I love these types of case studies. I love these kind of stories because it shows the dedication, and I don't know. That's why I like working with you.
Yeah, I'm never bored. We're always working on projects. It's always a challenge for us. It's to Michael's point. Now G3 is coming on board. They have questions as well. We just finished our conference a couple of weeks ago, and G3 was in that room, and she wants to come back every year. Now we're thinking about just to give you a little sidebar. We're thinking about when we do our annual conference. We're thinking about carving out a session for G2 now, where it'd be a 3-4 hour afternoon session to educate G2 on what G1 put together and the reasons why. And so the clients are real excited about that. So now we're moving into this now next step to working with G2. And that's also a success for our practice as well, because it grows our practice and it keeps it consistent and it keeps everybody together. So it's just we think it's a wonderful paradigm shift that we're creating, I think, in our practice. I'm a little proud of it because it does have impact, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Anything else for closing thoughts today, Michael?
No, I think that I hope that this was, obviously we could have talked in a lot more detail on some of the planning that we did, but hopefully it was a good case or two different case studies on sort of one where it might not work out for various reasons, and one where we think it did. And so hopefully that came across to our listeners here.
Yeah. And the parallel that I drew between these two stories is you've got a gentleman that has worked hard, very successful, has the nephew, but it's just one person, right? It's just one nephew that's going to be taking over the business or is already working in the business. And so I think the overall attitude is, I'm not really too concerned about it because he's going to, he's running the show, so on and so forth. The second story, I think you mentioned there's 3 kids to begin with. And I think any parent is not that a nephew and a child is going to be that much different, depending on how close they are. However, when you have multiple people that are involved, you have to strike that balance. You have to make sure it's fair. And, it's you guys have spoken about fair versus equal before. You got a lot to balance there, and so I think that any parent's going to say, hey, look, anything I can do to stop these kids from squabbling, or going through a hardship, when something happens, I want to make sure that works out for everybody. So that's kind of where I saw these 2 stories going. So I love that. So, all right. And so if folks are just saying, hey, look, this is, part of this is my story, and I'd like to explore that with these guys, why don't you give them contact info so they can reach out?
Sure. You can reach us on LinkedIn. Both my father and myself and Copper Beach have a LinkedIn page. You can go to our website, which is www.cbfgllc.com. And you can call us on the phone, 856-988-8300.
All right. Thank you, guys. It's been a great podcast. I love these case studies. I just love them.
Thanks, Eric.
You bet. And of course, our last thank you is going to go to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast with John and Michael Parise. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when John and Michael come out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask that you share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, because this actually does help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at Copper Beach Financial Group, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Truth About Wealth podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Copper Beach Financial Group. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.
This material is for informational purposes only. Neither APFS nor its representatives provide tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please consult your own tax, legal, or accounting professional before making any decisions. Copper Beech is not affiliated with American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Securities offered through American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc., a member of FINRA SIPC, investment advisory and financial planning services offered through American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., an SCC registered investment advisor. These opinions are subject to change at any time without notice. Any comments or postings are provided for informational purposes only and do not constitute an offer or a recommendation to buy or sell securities or other financial instruments. Readers should conduct their own review and exercise judgment prior to investing. Investments are not guaranteed, involve risk, and may result in a loss of principal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. Investments are not suitable for all types of investors. Copper Beech is an unaffiliated entity of American Portfolios Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolios Advisors, Inc. Any opinion expressed in this forum is not the opinions of American Portfolio Financial Services, Inc. and American Portfolio Advisors, Inc., and have not been reviewed by the firm for completeness or accuracy. American Portfolios and Copper Beech Financial Group are not affiliated with any other named business entities mentioned.